Good afternoon. Have we become a species of psychochemical dependence throughout our life course in an attempt to control brain and behavior? And if we have, does it matter? When did the 3 R's of elementary school become reading, writing, and Ritalin? Why is midlife for many a time of not only parenting, but Prozac? What are the ethics of a healthy individual enhancing brain capabilities through supplements in ways similar to an athlete who uses performance-enhancing drugs? A prominent neuroscientist and one of the founders of the field of neuroethics, Dr. Farah is at the forefront of the ethical debates and dilemmas, focusing on the impact of neuroscience applications and advances and the place of neuroscience in society. For most researchers, these questions alone would provide a career's worth of intrigue and intellectual investment. But this is actually the 3rd phase of Dr. Farah's career. If you don't believe me, ingest a healthy dose of liquid trust and scan the internet for yourself. Dr. Farah's earliest work was in visual cognition, followed by pioneering research in the neuroplasticity of impoverished children living under acute stress, and the profound effects this has on the inability to break the cycle of generational poverty. Both of these seemingly unrelated areas of scholarly investigation early in her career are now melded in her work in neuroethics. Dr. Farah graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with degrees in metallurgy and materials science and in philosophy. She received a Ph.D. in experimental psychology from Harvard, and in 1992, she accepted a position in the Department of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where she served as the director of both the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and the Center for Neuroscience and Society. She presently serves as the Walter Annenberg Professor in Natural Sciences at Penn. In addition to more than 125 journal articles, Farah is the author of 2 books and the editor or co-editor of 5 others, including, most recently, Neuroethics, an introduction with readings published in 2010 by MIT Press. Among her many prestigious recognitions, she has been selected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It is a pleasure to introduce, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Martha Farah.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, all the rest of the Gusties who have really put on the most wonderful conference I think I've ever been to. This has just been a delightful experience. So let me dive right in with a quick look at 6,000 years of neuroscience history, going from the ancient Sumerians, who first documented the relationship between holes in the head and psychological deficits, which obviously can shed light on how psychological processes are organized in the brain, through this same fellow that Descartes included in one of his writings on the sort of mechanical reflex arc that Paul was just telling us about, and on through modern day neuroscience with wonderful developments like structural MRI, like you see in this rightmost picture. Well, over the span of this 6,000 years, I am going to make a generalization that I think really is only has one or two minor exceptions. I'll leave it as an exercise to you to try to figure out what they are. But across all this time, developments in neuroscience can be classified into one of two general categories. The first is basic science. Okay, this is understanding how the brain works, because that's an interesting problem in its own right. So, for example, studying the response properties of single neurons, like you see somebody about to do right there. The other general category into which all of these developments over this 6,000-year history can be put into is applied medical science, specifically understanding how to diagnose and treat psychiatric and neurological disorders. But as we move into the 21st century, actually very conveniently corresponding with the turn of a century, we see something new arising in neuroscience. We see many developments that don't fit neatly into either of those two categories. We see applications of neuroscience that are not medical. We see applications of neuroscience to education. For example, people trying to understand how children learn to read and how to decide when a child is able to learn to read, what kind of reading method or teaching reading method is going to best help them become literate, for example. We see developments in economics and the more applied side of that, neuromarketing. So the use of neuroscience to try to better sell soap or vacations or whatever else somebody is trying to sell. We see the beginnings of neuroscience applied to law, both to the criminal justice system, to managing criminal offenders and rehabilitating them, and also to trying people in criminal and civil proceedings. And to take one more example, we see neuroscience being applied in the military to make better, more effective warfighters, as they're now called, to make weapons, new weapons that involve the nervous system, non-lethal weapons that confuse or just sedate, put to sleep the enemy. Many, many new applications of neuroscience. They're not basic science, they're applications, but they're not medical applications. They're to all other areas of life. Now, why is that? Why now are we seeing this plethora of new kinds of applied neuroscience? Well, basically, it's because as we segued from the end of the 20th century into the beginning of the 21st, basically, cognitive neuroscience got on its feet. Cognitive neuroscience became a going concern, along with affective and social neuroscience. We can now begin to understand the neural bases of feelings, moods, emotions, behaviors, economic decision-making, as you just saw, social relationships, as Larry Young spoke about yesterday. After many, many decades, no centuries of being fairly limited in the psychological processes that we could map onto the brain, to basically like sensory processes, fairly evolutionarily old motivational states, what are sometimes called the four F's of survival: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and sexual reproduction. Sorry, I hesitated there a minute about whether I should come out with that, but the undergraduates usually like it. So these are kind of fairly primitive subcortical mechanisms that we share with huge sectors of the animal world. But thinking, music, these higher level processes have only recently become accessible by neuroscientists, and that is thanks to new technologies for studying the normal human brain, for example, MRI, the images that you see on the left, and new theories for understanding brain function that are inspired by computers and computational formalisms. So, what that means is now, after all this time, we can really begin to understand the neural bases of human thought, feeling, and behavior. And this really does not go back that far in time. Now, if we can understand these things, then suddenly we can bring neuroscience to bear on all the different human endeavors where being able to understand, predict, even control human behavior is important, okay? And that includes everything from education to warfare. So to just give you a little sketch, an overview of where I'm going in this hour, I'm going to begin by reviewing some of the current and foreseeable future applications of neuroscience in our lives in these multitude of different human endeavors outside of clinical medicine. And also, and those include brain enhancement, which Richard was talking about in the intro. They also include brain imaging. And I'm going to talk about something that I think in some ways may be even more consequential, and that is the way we think about ourselves and our place in the universe, and how neuroscience has affected that self-understanding. And in each case, we'll talk some about the ethical issues raised by these developments. So to begin with brain enhancement, and the time-honored way of doing that, psychopharmacology, drugs. Now, let me just be clear. When I say brain enhancement, I'm using the word enhancement to distinguish this from brain therapy. This, what I'm going to be talking about, is not restoring lost function, is not healing the sick. It's taking happy, normal, functioning people and making them even better than normal, okay? And of course, it's the American way, self-improvement, and we're now seeing that American way join forces with neuroscience with some interesting results. So one example of psychopharmacologic brain enhancement is the use of prescription stimulants mainly prescribed for treatment of attention deficit disorder by normal, healthy students as study aids, okay? The thought is, and I'm going to phrase this carefully because in fact I think the data are not so clear that this is really true, but the thought is that if they can take a person with ADD and give them normal attention, then these drugs can take somebody with normal attention and give them super good attention, okay? And in the questions, if you're interested in what the data are there, we can talk about it. But this is very common on college campuses. I did a little research yesterday with some of the students here, and yes, it happens at Gustavus too. A national survey, large kind of epidemiological, stratified, blah, blah, scientific survey, with data collected in 2001, and I think the use has increased since then, found that 7% of college students had done this, had used prescription stimulants, not as a medical therapy, but to help them study. And on some campuses, it's as high as 25%. In fact, more recently, we have even larger numbers coming up in probably less well-designed surveys. So clearly, this is using the fruits of clinical neuroscience for a non-medical aim. And shortly, we will be talking about pros and cons of that. There are other drugs out there, however, that may be less familiar to you, like the drug modafinil, which was developed for the treatment of narcolepsy. It's a disorder of wakefulness where you can just, in the middle of working, driving, potentially very dangerous, just fall asleep. This drug keeps you awake, and in fact, if you're a normal person without narcolepsy, you can use this drug to stay awake, functioning quite well, and feeling quite well for days at a time. Okay? Now, I hasten to add, I'm not recommending you run home and ask your doctor for a prescription for this, because it makes you feel okay while you're using it and not sleeping, but it does not protect your body from the very serious ill effects of sleep deprivation. So this is not a magical cure for having more time in the day. Nevertheless, it is being used in this way by sizable numbers of healthy people out there. And it's in response to this concept of extreme jobs, people who are working 60, 80 hours a week, want to be on, want to get an extra work day's worth of work into their work week. Not so common among students because it's expensive, but I've read that Silicon Valley workers use a lot of this stuff. So does the military, because obviously, when you're pushing into Baghdad, you can't say, well, it looks like it's time for Betty Buys, and just all go to sleep. So this can be life-saving for soldiers, for flyers on long missions to stay awake and alert. Of course, the military uses various other kinds of pharmacologic enhancements for their soldiers as well. So yet another non-medical application of these drugs that were originally developed for medical purposes. This is a website for a company, Memory Pharmaceuticals, that is developing new drugs. Nothing on the market yet, but their aim is to develop memory-enhancing drugs. And if you look at this little pie chart there, it shows what the different indications are that they are aiming to treat or to address with these new drugs. And notice one of them is called age-associated cognitive decline. Okay, that is not an illness. That is by definition, not mild cognitive impairment, not some other dementia. This is the normal, relentless decline in memory ability as you go from your 30s to your 40s to your 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. And this is, explicit goal of this company, started by Eric Kandel, famous neuroscientist. So, the thought is that, aging boomers are going to want some help with their memory to stay competitive in the job market, to, enjoy their life, function fully for longer. And we have, in this case, not drugs that are here now, but drugs being developed for this purpose. Okay, this is a picture that comes from the research that Larry Young was talking about yesterday. Whoops. Oh. This shows the results of how generous players are in an economic game when given oxytocin intranasally or given placebo intranasally. And as you can see, the bar on the left, people transferred significantly more dollars per game to the other player when they were on oxytocin. Now, as Larry pointed out, you don't really have to worry yet that some unscrupulous business associate is going to slip you some oxytocin up your nose before you have an important negotiation, because basically it's very hard to get past the blood-brain barrier, and you have to really stick something up somebody's nose, and you can't do that, at least while they're awake, in a way that they would not notice. But, okay. However, there is work going forward, as Larry mentioned, in creating other molecules that will stimulate the oxytocin system. For example, here's a 2010 paper reporting on a drug that does cross the blood-brain barrier, and you can take this orally and effect results similar to oxytocin. So again, this is not out there today, but it's proof of principle, it's coming, and you can imagine the huge motivation to put this to work, not just in business dealings. What about, how about the Middle East peace talks? Let's just give everybody lots of oxytocin agonists for their own good, for everybody's good, right? That's a joke, but it certainly illustrates. I guess Richard, who's the political science professor, is probably shaking his head now, but anyway. Clearly, there's a lot of good, as well as kind of selfish mischief that you could do with drugs that manipulate generosity and trust chemically. There's also the possibility of using psychopharmacology to improve people's brains for the sake of our safety and their own well-being. Okay, the criminal justice system has long meted out punishment for multiple reasons. Yes, we punish out of retribution. We're going to even the score. We're going to make you suffer by locking you up in prison or worse. But we also sentence people to anger management therapy. We sentence people to anti-androgen treatments, which is also called chemical castration. And the sex hormones work on more than one organ, okay? So this is clearly a central nervous system intervention that is state mandated in many states for sex offenders who have offended multiple times. In addition, SSRIs show promise, both, in fact, for sex offenders, because what's a troublesome side effect for people using these drugs as antidepressants, namely reduced libido, is a plus if you're trying to help a sex offender avoid recidivating. And they also quell violent impulses. Again, a non-medical use for medications. There are new ways of tweaking the brain for pleasure and profit, enhancing brain function, that don't involve molecules, that involve gadgets. For example, transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you induce a weak current in the brain using magnetic fields generated outside the head. And transcranial direct current stimulation, where you have an anode and a cathode, and you run a weak current through the brain. And rather astonishingly, these methods have measurable effects on psychological function, have relatively specific and selective effects on psychological function. That is, they can alter mood, or they can alter working memory capacity, or impulsivity. A number of different psychological enhancements in normal subjects have been found using these methods. So this is something else that, in fact, the military is exploring in experimental work, and various other laboratory groups as well. Deep brain stimulation is not going to be used for enhancement anytime soon. Obviously, nobody's going to say, I would like to, improve my musical ability, so, I'm going to make an appointment with the brain surgeon to have a gadget put in my brain that will require, extensive maintenance and upkeep. But let me suggest to you that as this method becomes more common as a treatment for illness, movement disorders, mood disorders, there will, I believe, inevitably come a point where people say, well, as long as I'm being implanted with this thing, is there a way that I can tickle some other part of the brain to achieve some other beneficial enhancement while I'm at it? And to get a sense of just how enhancing these things could be, let me show you an excerpt from a transcript that's on the website of President Bush's Presidential Bioethics Commission from a patient who was implanted by the surgeon Reese Cosgrove, who said, when I'm home doing my regular things, I'd prefer to have contact 2, that is the little electrode number 2, active. But if I'm going out for a party where I have to be on and I'm going to do a lot of socializing, I prefer contact 4 because it makes me revved up and more articulate and creative, okay? So clearly being able to exploit the slight differences in electrode placement for psychological effects that this woman likes. And he has other anecdotes as well about patients noticing psychological enhancements as, sort of happy side effects of their treatments. So in sum, lifestyle use of brain enhancement by students to improve academic performance, that is here now. By busy professionals to add hours to their days, that is here now. By aging boomers to maintain competitiveness, not here now, at least not in the form that Cortex Pharmaceuticals or memory pharmaceuticals is trying to offer. And other societal uses, such as correcting antisocial behavior in criminal offenders and enhancing soldiers. These are some of the non-medical ways that neuroscience is changing and is poised to change our lives. So let's quickly look at some of the ethical implications of all this. The first issue is freedom to use enhancers. I mean, I think often we have an initial reaction of, ooh, this is terrible, this is like the road to creepy, brave new world, let's just agree that we're not going to use these things. But really, I think an argument can be made that if something is safe and doesn't put anybody else at risk, we would have to think pretty hard before saying you can't use these things. However, there's the flip side of that, which is the freedom not to enhance. Okay. Now remember, we talked about military uses, criminal justice system uses. In the criminal justice system, if you sentence somebody to anger management therapy, they have the choice to sort of go and space out and think this is such a load of bunk, I want nothing to do with this. But they go and they go through the steps. If you change their brain chemistry, change their personality, their interests, change the way they think about things and the way they experience life, you have deprived them of a kind of freedom that you haven't when you just put them in required therapy. So we're really talking about restricting people's liberty in a fairly unprecedented way when we talk about forcible medication of someone who is not medically ill for the sake of society. So I think we need to think about that pretty carefully. In the military, the use of these stimulants, modafinil, amphetamine, by military personnel is voluntary, and they sign an informed consent form. And the form says, I understand that if I choose not to take this drug, my commanding officer may find me unfit for duty. So, is that direct coercion? Is that indirect coercion? I don't know, but I think we're going to see this more and more. If you if you're in an accident and at 3 a.m. some surgeon is operating on you, maybe you would actually like that surgeon to be on modafinil so that they're awake and totally clear-headed if they've been woken up from the on-call room or something. Well, do we want hospitals to actually require their house staff to take these drugs? It might make your surgery come out better, but how do we feel about forcing people to change their brains for the sake of job performance? It bears thinking about. And of course, there's indirect coercion. So, if lots of other people in your school or workplace are benefiting with these drugs, you're going to feel under a certain amount of pressure to take them yourself. So, your boss could say to you, listen, there's lots of other people out there that I could hire to replace you who are willing to add an all-nighter to each work week. So why don't you just do like the rest of us and get some modafinil? So freedom not to enhance, I think, is going to become an issue with these enhancements that help productivity. There's also the issue of, is this cheating? You know, if you're in a class with somebody who gets an A on the exam and, you know, maybe that's because he took Adderall, is that equivalent to getting an A on the exam because he copied off his neighbor? There's also issues of what the bioethicists call distributive justice, fairness. You know, we already have haves and have-nots who who enjoy very different opportunities for education, for personal career growth. Do we really want to be adding yet additional enhancements? We need to think about that. What is the role of physicians in all this? Because right now, they are the gatekeepers. Okay, you can't go to the drugstore and, you know, or the 7-Eleven and buy modafinil. You have to get a prescription from your doctor. Are physicians healers, or are they, you know, self-enhancement coaches? You know, is it now? Of course, there are fields of medicine, cosmetic surgery, cosmetic dermatology being the most obvious ones, where physicians are basically your partner in being more beautiful, more successful, et cetera. But do we want psychiatry and neurology to be that way? Do psychiatrists and neurologists want that role? Another question. And finally, what does it mean to be human? Are we becoming post-human? And is that okay? Well, here is Matthew Nagel, the young man who worked with the Brain Gate researchers. You saw him earlier. Now, somebody like him had a terrible problem. He had a spinal cord injury. Yes, maybe he's post-human, but he's human plus, he's augmented human, partly machine, but he is, you know, it's for the sake of restoring his ability to function normally. But already we have people who are seeking out electronic augmentation. This interesting fellow is Kevin Warwick. He is a computer science professor at the University of Reading in England. And he just can't wait until we are all cyborgs. And he already has an electrode array implanted in his arm, which can pick up peripheral nerve signals to you know, open the garage door and, I don't know, you know, dial his wife on speed dial. I'm not exactly sure what the practical benefits are, but he is basically kind of getting ready first in line to augment his abilities electronically. Of course, there is this practice we already mentioned, using pills, medication, to enhance your work, and taken perhaps to a, you know, extreme, you know, literary imagination version. We have Brave New World, where people are they're managed with psychopharmacology. If you get too upset, you just take some soma, it chills you out. You don't worry about complaining about your lot. If you are raised to be a kind of worker drone, your brain is chemically treated while you're a fetus to make it less apt to question, to want more. You know, is this the direction we're going in? Let me point out, a lot of people, when they hear about brain enhancement, they think, oh my gosh, Brave New World, here we go. The really bad part of Brave New World is that there is a totalitarian regime that is out to, you know, take our liberty away from us, or has taken our liberty away from us. The fact that the means are pharmacologic and neural, you know, we don't want to blame neural interventions just because, as Aldous Huxley showed, they could be used for bad purposes. And in terms of this post-human idea, I think this cartoon says a lot. Can everybody read the bottom line? Is that visible from the back? The sort of little prehistoric man is saying to modern man, I was wondering when you'd notice there's lots more steps. Okay. So, we tend to be a little egocentric. We think this point in history, this point in the development of the species is special. But, it's all a process of cultural evolution, of physical, biological evolution. And, it may well be that our destiny is, for better or for worse, is to continue this development. And it's not necessarily for worse, just because it will make us different than we are now. Okay, so just to go back to the outline, we've talked a little bit about enhancement, the kinds of things that people can do, some of the issues that arise when you're considering pro or con. Now let me talk a bit about brain imaging. This is what you've seen the most of so far at this meeting. This fMRI scanner, MRI scanner, has lately been put to work not just on basic research on medicine, but also on, for example, marketing. So this is one of many companies that offers neuromarketing services. This is FKF Applied Research. Their website says, we look beyond the spoken word to provide immense and actionable insights into a brand, an advertisement, or a competitive framework. Find out the difference between what consumers say and what they are really thinking. So the pitch here is that these people, by using brain imaging, can really, in effect, read minds or read something about the person's mind that they cannot or perhaps just will not tell you. And interestingly, these companies are hired not only by other companies trying to sell products, conventional products, they've also been hired by political campaigns. So, something as important as democracy our democracy may be shaped by this appeal to neuroimaging. Another here and now example of non-medical imaging is lie detection. So this is one of two companies, it's called Cephos, that claims to be able to tell whether you're lying or telling the truth by putting you in a scanner. Let's see. Well, I'm looking for some tidbit to read from the website. The pitch is that this is objective, and of course it's scientific. It seems very high tech, and that sort of gives it a little halo of objectivity. Perhaps even the sense of being very accurate may or may not be true. This was the subject of a Daubert hearing, for those of you who are lawyers, about a year ago, to try to admit it as evidence in a criminal trial in federal court. And it was rejected. The magistrate said, basically, there has not been enough of a demonstration that we don't know enough about what the accuracy is, despite this website claiming 95% accuracy. We don't know enough about the accuracy under real-world conditions, and so it was excluded. But these people still are making a business of it by scanning people for non-legal issues, personal conflicts. Honey, I really was working late at the office. Look, I'll go in a scanner and prove it to you. An interesting educational application that's still, I have to say, in the research stage, but I think getting nearer and nearer to applicability, is in education, assessing reading readiness. I mentioned this before. Now, teachers for, a long time have had their ways of assessing when a kid is ready to learn to read. It involves doing rhyming games, things like that. What's interesting about what Fumiko Heft and her colleagues, including John Gabrielli, did was that they did all those things, and they also scanned the kids, and they showed that the scanning, it doesn't just predict, it predicts over and above the most information that you could get from the traditional methods. Okay? So since a big part of the battle in getting kids to read is figuring out when they're ready to learn and not making them and you miserable trying to teach them when they're not ready, this is potentially very, very helpful. Ethical issues here, the obvious one is mental privacy. We've always assumed that what goes on just inside our own heads is safe from prying eyes and ears. Perhaps it's not with brain imaging. You saw examples from Paul Glimcher's work of how he could tell that guy wanted the Moleskine notebook without having to ask the guy. Could we also find out your sexual preference? I mean, the answer is pretty clearly yes. There are different patterns of activation when shown, erotic pictures of the love objects that you prefer compared to the ones that you don't prefer. There are many very personal kinds of information that can, in principle, be read from brain imaging. Whether we're really ready to stuff somebody in a scanner and, well, I guess we don't have don't ask, don't tell anymore, but, whether we're really ready to accurately classify individual people is another question. But I suspect we are in some contexts and not in others. So mental privacy. How accurate does a predictor need to be put to use? Is 90% good enough? Do you want 99.999%? Is 60%? Let's say it's a 50-50 choice. If you're just a little bit better than chance, is that worth using? Well, it's obviously going to depend a lot on the kind of information and the context. But worth thinking about. In the legal context, is something that you tell investigators via brain activation, is that testimony? Or is that some other kind of evidence? And are images overly persuasive? And it's certainly been claimed that one of the biggest immediate dangers of brain imaging is that we go gaga over them, and that you can sell us any stupid product you want, by sort of saying, look, brain imaging has shown that this brain training game takes 10 years off your memory ability or something. I actually, my own feeling is that a lot of that research has not been well done, and yes, we're interested in brain images. We find the stuff more interesting to look at. I'm not convinced that it really is kind of like Svengali. Oh yes, I see a brain image, I'll do anything you want me to, which the literature sometimes makes it sound like. Okay, finally, I want to talk a little bit about ideas, not new technologies, not new drugs, devices, brain imaging, but just ideas, how we think about ourselves in this new neuro world. One excellent statement of the neuroscience worldview comes from Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of the structure of the DNA molecule, who later in his life became interested in neuroscience. And he wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. And that hypothesis is basically that we are our brains. And he says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And I'm guessing that there's a range of reactions in this audience to like, duh, of course, to, well, he can't mean my soul and my love for my country and, all those things. Well, basically the question is this all there is? Is this little 3-pound hunk of meat really all there is to a human person? I think the ethical issues here, from just the very idea that we are no more than a big fancy neural network, are the following. One is this idea of what a person is. And I think Nancy Murphy is going to talk about this later. Am I right, Nancy? Dualism? Yeah, some? Okay. And certainly she has taught me a lot of what I know about this issue. But most people think that there is some non-material part of a person above and beyond the 100 or 200, or if you're Chris Christie, 300 pounds of a person that you can, see and touch, okay? Sometimes people talk about it as the soul or the spirit. Sometimes people talk about it just as the mind, the personality. But there is a very deeply rooted intuition. In fact, Paul Bloom, a cognitive psychologist at Yale, has studied the development of this intuition in children and finds that at a very young age, kids, by their behaviors, even before they can talk, by their behaviors show that they think of people as the physical part and then some, okay? The part that has the intentions, the beliefs, the experiences, the feelings. This is dualism, two parts of a person, material and immaterial. It's sometimes been called the ghost in the machine, okay? So neuroscience is studying the machine, but there's also this ghost that really sort of animates it and makes it human. Here's the problem. If neuroscience continues on the trajectory that I would say it's on right now, which is basically everything you can think of about a person has a physical basis that we can see in the scanner or record with an electrode or change with a little jolt of electricity or a molecule going to some receptor. If everything about a person, their feelings of love and loyalty, their moral sense of what's right and wrong, everything can be explained within the realm of physical science, which is what neuroscience does, then why would you believe that there's any immaterial thing in the picture at all? If the machine can do it all, why have a ghost? Okay? Now, this is a puzzle, but I do think that my reading of neuroscience says that it really challenges the notion that there is a non-material part of any of us, that it really says we are a very wonderful, still somewhat mysterious, physical mechanism. Now, does that contradict the views of, the world's major religions? Not necessarily, and this is where Nancy's work has been very illuminating for me. It turns out that many religions, including the Jewish and Christian traditions, have at least parts of them, because of course religions, they're, learned books tend to be, to come from many sources. There may be internal inconsistencies, but certainly there are parts of the Jewish and Christian traditions that are not dualist, that are materialist, that say this, we are physical. We are very important, special physical things, but we're physical things. This view that everything about a person is physical has huge implications for moral and legal responsibility. Because if everything I do is caused by physical processes in my brain, and our best understanding of the physical universe is that it is deterministic, then everything I do is caused by physical processes. It has nothing to do, there's no free will. It's all a function of, what happened at the time of the Big Bang, okay? And sort of more proximally, it's all a function of the genes that I was born with and the experiences that I've had. So how can you hold anybody responsible for anything? Now, we do have this concept of not guilty by reason of insanity. We have, defenses based on brain injury. But this basically says for any of us, we can say, my brain made me do it. Okay. So how do you square this emerging view of the human person as a neural network with our long-held and intuitively very sensible-seeming notions of responsibility and free will? And finally, if all we are is physical stuff, what the heck does anything matter? I mean, do I care whether, one leaf blows east or west outside on that lawn? No. So why should I care if you or I, happens to get, run over by a truck or whatever, right? What does anything matter? How do you find meaning in a physical world? Steven Weinberg, who's a physicist, wrote about this and said, basically, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. And I think that if that's a problem in physics, it's even more of a problem in neuroscience. So let me just finish by saying that, even if I'm thinking my neuroscience thoughts and, viewing it as all a physical system, and at some level it doesn't matter, the second I step back into my normal human being mode, I do think things matters. What is the segue I'm looking for here? This conference has been very meaningful to me, and it's wonderful to get to communicate with you all. I look forward to your questions. And I want to say that if you're interested in learning more about the social, ethical, and legal implications of neuroscience for all aspects of our lives, I want to invite you to visit our website, neuroethics.upenn.edu, where we have, announcements of talks and this and that, but also readings, videotaped lectures, and other things that you can interact with and learn more. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Farah, for that wonderful talk. We will convene our panel for one last time for a question and answer period. We'll try to get this going as quickly as possible. So I'll ask them to come to the front. Send your questions forward on the pieces of paper or by the internet.
Well, thank you, Dr. Farah, for a wonderful talk. And I'm just wanting to start with conversations again from the panel. Questions?
9 a.m., but you're staying.
Any questions? Where would like to start?
I'll ask one. It was a really nice framing of all the range of things we can worry about. I'm glad I do applications in medicine. So, because you always get asked, well, aren't you worried about these things for the patients? And at the end of the day, we're just trying so hard to just get our patients approximately to normal that, the idea of better than normal doesn't occur to us. But I think it's very important to consider it. It did, something did come up because it comes up in discussion with patients where we always kind of think that the ability, particularly in mental illness, to put it into the brain reduces stigma. That actually you start to hear more and more that people think it creates a new kind of stigma, that it is my brain, it's not about me, and it brings up this issue of kind of your own autonomy and maybe that goes to the machine. But something that occurred to me in your talk was, if you found a brain abnormality in a criminal, and in fact you reduce something from just a choice to actual illness, quote unquote, could imaging now define a new form of pathology? That if you're different, are you abnormal? And hence now you go from where it might be imposing a decision on someone who's not ill to now you create illness in order to impose that intervention. And how do you it might be something Nancy might bring up later, but how might we think about imaging in that context?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. People have, lamented that the trend towards what's called medicalization sort of reinterpreting every bad thing that we don't like as an illness, right? And the let's see. I'm thinking there's various things I would like to say about medicalization in that context. I think in terms of the slippery slope that it puts us on in the criminal justice system, there's some abnormality here, or somebody killed somebody in cold blood. That's prima facie evidence that they're abnormal, right? So should we just be giving a pass to anybody who commits a criminal act because they must be crazy, or they must be dysfunctional, or yes, indeed they do have a hyperactive amygdala, which is why they flew into a rage, whatever. There have been attempts to kind of introduce a little ledge on that slippery slope and keep us from going all the way down. And the one that I think is most promising is offered by my colleague Stephen Morse at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He basically says the legally relevant fact about a person's brain dysfunction is not that it's abnormal or that it's dysfunctional. It's whether it caused that person to lack rationality, to be unable to make a rational decision. So if you can be abnormal but still able to rationally choose among courses of action, assess the Paul Glimcher values of different courses of action, and then make the choice of the one with the highest value to you. If the one with the highest value to you is killing an innocent person because you want their sneakers or something, then that is you deserve to be punished. We're not going to let you off for that. So basically, what Morse says, and I think is reasonable, is the question is not, was the behavior caused? Because of course all behavior is caused. The question is not, was the behavior dysfunctional, or did it ensue from a dysfunctional brain? Because of course those things are true too. The question is, was the person acting rationally, that is, choosing the outcome that they wanted or not? I think it may not always be so easy to map that onto a given case, but I think it sort of shows you where you could sort of stop that slippery slope and appropriately use neuroscience information to decide on guilt.
Wonderful talk. One of the most important things that humans have are beliefs. I have a belief in justice, or I have a belief in God, or I have a belief in the goodness of others. We can look at that in the brain. I suppose we could stick somebody in a scanner and say, think about your beliefs. And we might get some areas lighting up. But does that mean we really understand what belief is mechanistically and feel that we have a neural explanation? I mean, we operate in a day-to-day world where those beliefs really influence our actions. So what does it mean to study something like that neuroscientifically? The fact that we can do that in a scanner, what ethical issues does that raise?
Oh boy, well, I mean, one thought I have to offer on this is that we've learned from both decades of psychology research and now neuroscience research as well, that people often have multiple beliefs on a given, multiple conflicting beliefs. So you can, for example, say, I'm all in favor of civil rights. I don't judge people by the color of their skin, and so forth. And yet, you may react with fear, with mistrust, in certain circumstances just because of the color of somebody's skin. So at some level you could say, yeah, at some level you believe that an unknown black man is more of a danger to you than somebody that fits a different description. And certainly neuroscience has helped to illuminate that. I think that adds a little nuance to the whole question of can we read people's beliefs? Because it says, well, there's multiple beliefs to be read. You need to make sure that you're reading the one that's most relevant to predicting, behavior in that situation.
Thank you.
I'll just make a comment. You were talking about pharmacological enhancement of brain function, and it just occurred to me, you were talking about modafinil and the issues related to that we've been doing that for thousands of years. In the office, people have coffee, and that is used to enhance performance. And in the evening, we have wine, and that's used as sort of a social oil, to have us to be able to communicate. And so I think it's sort of like that step, that the ladder, or the steps that you showed, where you have the caveman and the modern man, and we're just taking one more little step with that. Another issue is related to the work that I've been doing and thinking about. Autism is autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum, obviously, and there are people with Asperger's syndrome who have some social deficits, but they're really able to function in the world, to a good extent. And there is real concern among some of those individuals in that community that if drugs were used early on by their parents, if the parents decided, oh, my child is not very social, I would like for him to be more social, that it could really improve their social functioning and maybe move them out of the Asperger's range. But they are very cautious about that. They would not want their parents to have that opportunity to have that sort of that treatment. So I wonder if you might comment on that.
That's a fascinating question. I mean, one, just in a more general way, concern about all this enhancement stuff is that it's going to make us much more homogeneous, that we're all going to be, and I think you may already see that. I don't know data on this, but I suspect you already see that with people's appearance, that, I don't know, there's fewer, big noses and less gray hair around, and, people, so I think there may just be less variation as we all use the available technologies to sort of approximate, the societal ideal. And, clearly, you may lose something as a society by having so much homogeneity, and as you say, people may prefer themselves. I guess another issue is, I think we have to distinguish between enhancement decisions made by competent adults and enhancements of kids. Yeah. And so, and you get similar things with cochlear implants for deaf children,
Right, and parents would like to change a lot of things about their kids if they could.
Yeah.
So actually, this all raises a question in my mind that just popped into my head, which also raises some interesting neuroscience questions. But maybe we should have a neuroscience of normalcy. I mean, and one of the things that's the standard here is what is normal. And I think if you went back to 1850, I remember reading, and I don't know the source, in 1850, people routinely slept, I think, 12 hours a night. And this is because there was nothing to do, and this was normal. And if you probably were staying up and only sleeping 8 hours a night, you weren't normal. So we've shifted our set of normal. It isn't a fixed thing. So I mean, it raises a whole lot of issues of how we decide on what's normal, and do we have a neuroscience of normalcy?
I agree. That's a fascinating question, and I also think that what we consider normal is influenced by neuroscience. So, for example, the people who worry about trends in medication of ADHD in kids point out that the new structure of a school day in many school systems, including the school district of Philadelphia, has, 6-year-olds basically sitting at desks, from 8 to 3 or something, right? So if you can't do that, you may end up being diagnosed with ADHD and being given Ritalin, and then you can do it, and then other kids who can't do it seem like they're abnormal. I think some of these enhancements can sort of raise the bar of what's considered normal. And, paradoxically, then we're all sort of back where we started in terms of competitive advantage, although, we may be in a different place, better or worse. Worse, more drugged kids, better, maybe learning more, I don't know.
Who decides, though? I mean, how do we come to a decision as to what we accept as normal behavior? Is it 12 hours a night of sleep or 8 hours a night?
Yeah.
6 or 4?
That's a good question. But if it were up to me, I would say 12 hours. I like to sleep.
You mentioned just briefly distributive justice, and you showed the photographs of the well-off child with the computer and the other little kid playing in the dirt. I know you've done a lot of work on the neurological effects of poverty in children. Would you say a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. I guess it would not surprise anybody to learn that growing up poor is not good for your brain. In fact, it's probably not, it's probably kind of bad for your brain. However, the magnitude of these effects is really quite stunning. So, in samples that we've looked at, we get, effect sizes of a standard deviation or more in language ability, executive function, prefrontal function. I do think, in terms of how this intersects with neuroethics, one thing is we often end up wringing our hands and hyperventilating, at the thought that, too many students are taking Adderall and, they shouldn't be or whatever. But this is a more familiar problem than, prescription medications. Poverty's been around as long as humanity has. But it is, it's probably got a bigger impact than, students trading Adderall pills down in the basement of the library. And I think, and it's every bit as, it has every bit as much of an impact on the brain that taking these pills does. So, there is something about familiarity, enabling us to be blasé about problems, not feel that they're urgent. This is not the reason that I'm doing this research, but one side effect that I hope the research might have is that when you can show the impact of the stress, the lack of cognitive stimulation, the violence in the neighborhood and so forth, when you can show the impact of those things on poor children in terms of brain scans, that it may overcome some of that, oh ho hum, we know poverty's bad, but so what, and may put it more in the realm of, a neuroethical problem,
It may be one case where the picture is really convincing, and it should be.
Yeah, thank you, yeah.
Any more questions from the panel? So we've got quite a few to choose from here. The first one, I'll sort of combine it with a couple of others. With all of these moral hazards in research, who decides? How are we going to decide? How do you regulate this? Where do we start?
Let me take one piece of that. Obviously, for research, we have IRBs, institutional review boards. We have, the FDA that regulates the use of medications and devices. But, it's not their job to worry about the larger kind of social impact of these things. But let me take a piece of that, which is who decides which of these technologies get developed for what purposes? One thing that concerns me is that most neuroscience research traditionally has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, or the National Science Foundation, if it's basic science research, or a number of different foundations that are private foundations that are disease-based. So basically, the funding landscape in neuroscience corresponds to these two general categories that I talked about before, basic science and medical, applied science. And now that we have these ways of using neuroscience to do interesting non-medical things, to solve non-medical problems, the question is now which ones of those are going to get developed and how are they going to be applied? And as far as I can see, to a first approximation, this is largely falling to private interests. So Cephos Corporation says we can make money by offering lie detection, right? Or neuromarketers, we can make money offering marketing advice. Or there are quite a few companies that make educational software that is at least kind of inspired by neuroscience. And I think that it's beneficial in terms of what actually gets developed and what we learn about it to have some public funding for these things, because he who holds the purse strings gets to partially set the agenda, at least, gets to say, these applications are really going to benefit society. Those will make a buck by pandering to, some of our baser interests, But if it's all people who are just out to make a buck, capitalism is good in many ways, but I think it really needs to be balanced with some sort of public ownership. I think the people need to have a stake in what gets developed and in what information we have about what gets developed. What are the side effects? What is the efficacy, of these brain-based learning programs? If you're a corporation, and the efficacy turns out to be not too good, it's not in your interest to make that well known. If it's publicly funded, you're not going to have that incentive. So I do think in terms of who decides, there is a kind of an economic market. Oops. Oh, really? Yeah. But, that does require a little reconfiguration of how these technologies are funded.
Okay. And a sort of an indirect similar question is, then what is the role of the physician if some of these things move from medicine to non-medicine, that's kind of slope? How do we view the physician?
Yeah, well, my colleague Anjan Chatterjee at Penn, he's a neurologist. He coined the term cosmetic neurology. And, there are times when, he's revising yet another NIH grant, trying to keep his lab funded, and he says, I think I'm going to just set up a brain spa in Rittenhouse Square. And, I think a lot of physicians dislike the idea of just helping normal people try to be better than normal. But then again, I think there are lots of medical specialties where we've seen this development, and clearly in cosmetic surgery we've seen that, cosmetic dermatology, sports medicine. Trying to help somebody with their elbow so that they can play tennis is not exactly, preventing suffering or healing the sick. They could do pretty much everything, but just not serve as well. I think you can make a case that fertility medicine is also not really healing the sick. It's letting somebody who's past the normal age, where some people have infertility at the age when the typical person is fertile, but there are a lot of fertility docs are working, helping people in their 40s, women in their 40s have babies. As a woman who had a baby at 40, I'm very, I think this is a good thing, but let's not lose sight of the fact that this is not, healing the sick and alleviating suffering. This is enabling somebody to go beyond what the normal limitations of the human physiology allow. So, although it does sound a little creepy and a little cynical, to think of Anjan, doing little TMS treatments on people and, in a fancy salon, it's not that different from other things that have happened already in medicine, and we seem to be okay with those.
I think we have a neurologist who has an opinion.
I think it reflects in many ways the whole evolution of how we train young doctors and how we see the role of physicians in the care of patients. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath was very clear and the rules were very well defined. And it's changing. I mean, medical education costs $200,000. Of course, that sort of seems to be what an undergraduate training is at Emory these days, too. So the cost to be educated in what you're going to do has really changed. And I think who makes decisions, who even gets to make the medical decisions now has been taken out of the hands of physicians. So I think everything is changing. So, I mean, your slide about the idea is what would be wrong with it if it's safe and it's shown to be effective is going to be there because the whole model of society is changing, and the role of just taking care of sick people, there will people that ascribe to that in the same way, didn't take cosmetic dermatology. I mean, people who are interested in dermatology were not the same people that were interested in being an oncologist. People who wanted to be surgeons weren't the people that wanted to be a pediatrician. So I think there is room for everyone, but I think we're reaching a point now where because the tools are around, what we do with them has changed and what's available. I think the big problem will be is what will the market bear? And what will people be entitled to, and who will deliver those services? And parity is going to be something. I mean, not everybody may be able to have access to TMS, but then again, everyone may not have access to DBS or another limb to enhance even their functioning. And I think the whole system's going to have to be totally rethought, and I think your discussion has really kind of framed a lot of things that'll happen and be interesting to see in 10 years kind of where we are.
Okay, one last question. I've got to say, you're getting some of the hard questions. So this question comes in saying, if we share our genes, so many of our genes with other animals, and we know that other animals, particularly other primates, can show social behaviors, they have empathy, they can have rules and regulations. What makes us human? Are we special in any way? Are we? I mean, you may not have the answer, but go for it.
Oh boy! Well, I thought you were going somewhere else. So at the last minute, I was surprised by what makes humans special. Oh boy! Yeah. I don't know.
It's a big one. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Farah.